Sanguine Frost. This is a work of alternate historical fiction. This story takes place in a timeline different from our own. Persons and events depicted did not occur within our history, for they transpired centuries following the point in time at which this timeline took its own divergent path. This story may contain content that is unsuitable for younger audiences. I'm sure subject matter will not be glossed over, however, neither shall the minutiae of mature content, in particular violence and nudity, be relished in. This isn't the history you know. In the history you know, Europe fought amidst themselves for centuries after Rome fell. Kingdoms collapsed as soon as they'd risen. Faiths were challenged, cultures forced to adapt or die. In these vague terms, this other history is rather similar, but the details changed, the players all different. In 810, Ireland was united under one queen. In 879, her great-grandson conquered the other Celtic realms and made an empire. In 933, his relative launched an invasion of Norway that ended in Celtic victory 26 years later, establishing the Merchant Republic of Norway, which, with time, became its own entity distinct from the Celts, though nonetheless derived from them. In our timeline, the New World was discovered in 1492 by Castile in search of a new route to India. Here, it was discovered in 1457 by Norway in search of timber. The two realms from separate timelines had very different approaches to colonialism and very different priorities when it came to the growth of their new settlements. These differences inform a wildly different world from the one you know. This tale begins in January of 1496, nearly 40 years after the New World was discovered, and various goods and services previously unknown or unfeasible were becoming commonplace, and the Republic of Norway was beginning to creak under the pressure. Chapter 1. Thus Anew. Karpsal, Eastern Valleys, Norway, January 1496. A vacuous stench of death stung the shrieking wind. The gusts bore such a ghastly veneer that the dusk seemed to screech with the souls who left this mortal plane on this hour, in equal numbers claimed by the frost and by the whims of men. Karpsal, a quaint village so small, became smaller yet in the wake of the storm. The lucky few who endured the slaughter of the rebel sellswords all sat in their houses in disarray, bearing nary a grin nor happy thought, staring longingly into the endless white. Neighbors' homes became a distant memory, obscured so thickly by the abyss of snow that surrounded them on all sides, only countered by their walls and what fire they could ignite. One storm passes, another to come. The grave awaits those who set foot in the flurry of ice. The village of Karpsal was not without its essentials. A butcher's shop, closed indefinitely for the storm. A tax house, whose necessity was questioned by the locals. A well full of frigid and untenable water. And of course, a tavern, still open, undoubtedly necessary, and whose supply of drink never seems to run short. But the Dragon Raiders, sent from the Traders' Overguild to combat the rebel Smargatil, challenged this, as they weathered a different kind of storm. Storm of blood and viscera, which was itself approaching an end. The interior of the tavern was well lit, and decorated with polished wooden furniture. Long plain tables accompanied by benches, peered at on all sides by thick support beams, with torch sconces wielding the venue's earnest illumination. The building was filled with something between life and gloom, as the confused masses of survivors bickered amongst each other within the thoroughfare. The tavern keep, Emil Darndon, and his staff were scrambling to keep everything in order. The man himself was standing behind the bar, hands pressed and holding him upright. He wore an undyed cloth garment, with leather leggings, seemingly oblivious to the pervasive cold. He was peering down at the intricate woodwork of the counter, and yet he stared at nothing. And on certain situations such as this offers a man ample time to reflect. And Emil had much to think about. The rebel Smargatil was his own blood, a cousin of some degree, and the Proxim had ordered his death. Emil was reluctant, but chose to help the merchantry in Vrigna, and save his own hide by selling his kin out. The Dragon Raiders sat by the wall and gazed through the window facing northwest, sitting patiently and expectantly, as if they knew something was coming. The men were 9 strong, 8 carrying long wooden rifles of the highest caliber available in this era. Most of the soldiers were of European descent, albeit their skin kissed by a sun much hotter than what Scandinavia could muster. 3 of the men were of considerably darker complexion, haphazardly wearing desert nomad dress underneath their overcoats, and yet these 3 shivered more violently than their local brethren, for despite their shelter within the tavern, the frostbitten air was beyond their experience. The raider without a rifle, Kulbot, suddenly sat up and tapped the window with his finger. "There." Emil woke from his introspection and darted his gaze towards the raiders, now alert and curious. "What is it? More hirelings?" Emil asked with a twinge of dread. He slinked out from behind the bar and quickly shuffled over to the window, with other folks in the tavern gathering around and behind him. The tavern was now dead silent, barring the scattered mutters of the curious and the sharp winds frivolously brushing the outside. Through the window, the folk saw a sea of white, punctuated with bits of exposed wood and stone fashioned into walls and other fixtures, with an imposing peak looming in the distance, casting a growing shadow on the village. A small, heavily dressed figure could be seen shambling forth down the buried street towards the tavern, each step equally calculated and a leap of faith with the uncertainty of what lies beneath the frost's surface. The figure's tattered attire was dark brown, with a bright orange stripe across the torso, stained with a streak of blood. "Can't be him. Uniform's all wrong," said another dragon raider, Engar, now also standing with a rifle at the ready. Strapped to his white-gray fur belt was a dagger bearing the telltale curves of Syriac design, itself touched by blood that had long since dried. "That's an Archon lad. Gubart isn't a fool. I'm sure he took one of our outfits to hide," Colwood reminded. "Don't you remember what happened in Fayum?" "Point taken," Engar said with a hearty chuckle. He then straightened his stance, continuing to hold his rifle in anticipation. "Of course. I can't afford to be wrong." Colwood nodded, eyes still fixated on the approaching figure. The man, wrapped in several layers of cloth, was now around 24 paces from the tavern door. Engar held up a hand and waved to the other armed raiders, prompting them to surround the door with 3 raiders holding their rifles trained towards it, while the remainder drew their longswords in anticipation for a fracas. Several seconds passed, each seemingly longer than the last, each felt and whole as adrenaline pumped through every warm body on the correct side of the tavern door. Emil was sweating rivers off of his eyebrows, perhaps only one pang of self-awareness from biting out his nails. After what seemed an eternity passed, the door creaked. The raiders all glanced at one another in confusion. Colwood looked to Emil and pointed out the window towards the door, but was met with a tense shrug. "At the ready, lads," Colwood muttered, then carefully approached the door. Gasps from the tavern-goers could be heard almost in unison as he gripped the wooden handle, then ripped the door back as hard as he could. The clothed man tumbled onto the floor stomach-side, accompanied by chunks of heavy snow, himself unmoving. Colwood quickly slammed the door shut. Engar stepped towards the body and lightly kicked it, his rifle still trained at the center mass. The body moaned, at which point Colwood crouched and flipped the man over, then pulled back his face cover. The pale man underneath took in a deep, shaky breath, then chuckled weakly. He mumbled. The other dragon raiders then began to laugh one by one before Colwood lifted the man up and patted his back. "Gubart, you mad fool, you actually fucking made it back!" Colwood turned to glance at Emil. "Give this man whatever he wants, the Republic demands it." Surprised whispering and mumbling cast about the crowd of survivors as the soldiers carried Gubart by the arms towards the bar, Emil still at the window in shock. After Gubart was planted upon a stool and hunched over the wood, Engar turned to Emil and began tapping the bar. "Are you deaf, old man? Come pour this soda drink." Emil seemed to snap back into awareness with that comment, and his lips began to curl. "Have you any clue what you lot owe this establishment? I've counted at least 3 glasses to a man. That's 30 glasses. 24, Colwood corrected. "You know full damn well it's 24, you some rigger bastard. Only 8 of us took a glass, or 3. You're counting on us not knowing how to count up." "And at least 20 of those were Galibs," Engar chuckled, patting one of the darker soldiers on the back. Galib sported a cross embroidered on his left sleeve, covering the desert nomad garb underneath. The other soldiers all burst out laughing, and Emil grumbled various swears under his breath. "You know who to talk to about payment, Emil. You also know he'll tell you to consider it a necessary expense in aid of the Republic," Colwood said. "Speaking of, let me go retrieve the Veshing from his chambers." Colwood scurried off to the stairs adjacent to the bar. As he ascended, a loud creaking noise could be heard to a rhythm in the distance, increasing in volume with each step taken. Once Colwood reached the top of the staircase, he came upon a spotless, narrow hallway, punctuated with doors of varying condition, indicative of Emil's policy of handling complaints only as they came. Colwood sauntered down the corridor, the noise now accompanied by stern grunts. Once the noise reached a peak, Colwood stopped and reluctantly knocked on the door. No response, with the noise merely continuing. Colwood knocked again, this time with more force. The noise came to a stop, followed by muffled laughter from 2 people. "Apologies, my dear, it would seem the time has come," said a deep, booming voice, still muffled from behind the door. A brief creaking was heard before a rustling of cloth. "I couldn't wait 15 more minutes," crooned a woman seductively. Colwood coughed, then stood up straight. We will have ample time to resume back in Frigg, the male voice said assuredly. When you hear the pops, have a meal arranged for your passage back. The door opened, revealing a lavishly dressed man with a uniform strongly evoking an air of military experience, adorned with abundant ribbons and medals. He lacked a beard, instead sporting a thick mustache, and he wore a distinctive cap on his head. Above all else, his mere presence heralded simultaneous attention and silence, and yet he needed not demand either. This was Odd Strevinia, Veshing of the Traders' Overguild, known at large as Onliendrum, or the Dragon, reflective of his family's coat of arms. Lying on the bed behind him was a fine red-haired woman of somewhat stocky build, in the nude, though with most of her body obscured by the brown linens. Gomklutter Strevinia, Odd's wife. Kalbo coughed again. Will you be joining us on the march, Bonagoko? He inquired nervously with a chuckle, keeping his gaze forward. Odd and Goko both chuckled in response. If not for the oncoming blizzard, I would allow it, Odd said. He then walked past Kalbo and tapped his shoulder. Come along, lad. Let's hear the news. As Kalbo pulled the door shut, a loud creak followed by a crash could be heard as the upper hinge of the door frayed and split. Kalbo attempted to jostle the door shut, but Odd placed his hand on his shoulder and shook his head. The two men walked down the hall as Goko continued giggling. Odd and Kalbo were not even 3 steps down the staircase before the former announced outwardly to the tavern. Do not ascend before my wife emerges if you know what's good for you. Laughter erupted downstairs, muffled and clear as the two men arrived in the thoroughfare. Emil could be seen not laughing, rather standing gaunt with dread, as if realization had only now struck him, in seeing the executioner before him, that his cousin would die that night. Odd hurried over to sit next to Kubart, who was now downing a mug of ale, and leaned over to place his hand on the soldier's shoulder. Are you well, lad? He asked. Kubart finished the chug and slammed it to the bar, then nodded. Odd then laughed and repeatedly thwapped Kubart's shoulder. I hope you didn't drown too many of those. We need you set right. Barn, Kubart muttered, wiping his lips. Odd leaned in, ear now close to Kubart's mouth. He's at the barn up the hill. Get walk right for the slashing Odd gave him. Perfect, Odd said whilst wearing a tempered grin that seemed to shrink by the second as his face morphed to one of regret. We can corner him there. May God have mercy on his soul, spoke an unassuming man in drab robes, bearing a cross around his neck. The man gestured his right hand in the form of the signum crucis. Odd nodded to the priestly figure assuredly, then turned to another of the 3 dark-skinned soldiers besides Galib. This soldier, Martin, wore an elaborate suit of armor dyed worn purple and lined with wilting steel, perhaps smithed centuries prior to his birth and passed to him from his family upon conscription. On the breastplate he bore a coat of arms displaying 2 lions, one under a crescent moon and another under the Virgina's sun, sitting passively across from one another with swords in one paw each, iconography of the Kartharukasoy kings of Egypt and the Holy Land. Martin, have you anything to add? Odd asked, causing Martin to stand up straight and at attention, resting his rifle upright against his shoulder. The soldier cleared his throat, then began chanting a prayer in Greek, and then in Latin, before also waving the signum crucis. Odd sighed, then gripped some cloth under his chin and pulled up a face cover. Amen. Let's do what must be done. The winds had dulled to a lesser breeze outside, a calm before the storm. The dragon raiders marched up the hill with the caution of a fox, spread out ways along the line so as to prepare an effective rifle volley in the event of confrontation. The Mordogum retinues had already scattered or routed most of the sellswords, so with present information, Odd and crew only expected the odd straggler, grasping at hope for payment that would never come. Snow crunched and slushed in the wake of the soldiers' strides, as those appropriately armed held their rifles well above the snowfall. Odd traveled up the center of the 10 soldiers as the riflemen spread to the inner ends of the formation, whilst on either outer side walked Kubart and Kalbot, in one hand each wielding torches to combat the budding nightfall, whilst the other hand each grasped a blade of differing length and mold. The darkness ahead on their path was richer owing to the mountain to which the village clung, yet nary a flicker could be seen on the route nor adjacent. Not even the waking star saw fit to illuminate the earth below. The stark silence was almost deafening, with naught audible save the cacophonous stewing of frost underneath every step forward and the symphony of rhythmic struggled breaths wavering from the nip. The lads took care to make little else noise in the event of dreaded stragglers, or, perhaps more likely given the conditions, wolves. The bevy of buildings turned mounds of snow passed one by one behind the unit, never quite exiting view on account of the village's less than middling breadth, but all the same forgotten. The barn up the hill, itself also a holding of Emil Darndon, was built of Novastian colonial oak, and painted a dull off-white, almost hiding it amidst the surrounding snow, if not for the few dozen arrows lodged in its flanks. One feasibly could reach the structure from Emil's tavern within a few minutes' stroll, had they the luxury of maintaining a sane pace, unburdened by waist-high snow. Amidst an uncertain step forward, Galib felt his foot tap against something solid, causing him to plummet into the snow, carving a hole of equal shape. Engar turned and stepped carefully over to Galib and gave him a hand, standing up. Upon regaining his composure, Galib reached down to grab his fallen rifle, only to gasp in horror. Engar looked at what he saw as well, as the others only looked in his direction with curiosity. "What is it?" shouted Kubart from the farther side of the formation, cut short at the end by Oth raising a finger, then moving it to his nose. Engar and Galib both covered their faces in disgust. Engar reached down and brushed some of the snow aside, revealing underneath a stark white face of an elderly woman, frozen mid-shriek. Brushing more snow back revealed a midsection with a tattered and ripped shirt, crudely concealing a broken and bruised torso. Oth walked up to the horrid sight and sighed. "Poor lass. Looks like the Archon boys knocked her down and kept swinging," he lamented. Martin murmured a prayer in Greek. As Oth stood back up, a feeling of sheer dread swelled within him, his chest turning cold. The light on their western flank had disappeared. Oth creeped his way farther that direction, whereupon he found a seemingly random pit in the snow. Looking within, he found a torch, very recently doused in a struggle with the frost, and a body track dug out leading around the adjacent tax house. His pupils grew twicefold. "Where is Colbert?" The shade of the night continued to grow, now one fewer combatant to challenge it, and so too did uncertainty grow amongst the soldiers. "Don't yell his name," Engar spoke sternly with an average volume. "Only God knows what awaits us out here." A dull silence fell. The winds had stopped. Oth shut his eyes in anticipation for any noise, but a few minutes rolled by with nothing. Then it happened, a faint creak of wood in the distance, as if being stretched. Oth's eyes opened in less than a blink, and he inhaled sharply. "Get down!" All the soldiers complied immediately and without hesitation, with Oth following suit. They crouched down with their heads tucked under their arms, all within less than a second. The small plink and shudder of a stick sounded out across the street, followed by a similarly small crunch much closer to Oth. His eyes zipped towards the noise, and he saw the source. The tail of an arrow stuck out from the snow, the feather lightly flowing from its travel. "Archer, take cover!" Once more, with no hesitation, the dragon raider stood up and quickly ran to stand at the tax house wall, out of the archer's sight. They then crouched once more, keeping their heads out this time, with Galib and Martin scanning the roofs of buildings opposite their position for any spotters or flanks. "Listen to me very carefully, lad. I want you to put down your weapon and approach us from around the corner with your hands up." Oth shouted tersely. "If you comply, you will leave here with your life." Silence. Each of the soldiers were now sweating from the flowing adrenaline. Breaths swelled and loosed in quick succession. Oth looked at Engar and nodded, with Engar nodding back and dashing around the corner. Rifle out, ready for whatever was to come. He ran, or rather waddled as quickly as possible around the back, and began to ascend the slope of snow built around the back end of the building. After topping the roof, he held his rifle out and scanned, immediately spotting a figure standing out amongst the snowy background. He took aim. "Have you?" he announced, hoping to get the hostile to submit peacefully, but the figure merely dropped to its knees. Engar cautiously stepped towards the figure, eventually finding it to be much larger than one man. Martin and Kubart felt a liquid begin pouring onto their heads, and moving their heads aside, they saw a thick, dark red stream trickling from the roof. Blood. It began to color Kubart's tunic, whereas not much visibly changed, with Martin's given it was already deep purple. "All clear," the figure seemed to say, before holding both hands up and climbing to its feet, revealing a second mass of shadow still lying on the roof. In the waning glimmer of dusk, Engar saw the figure's face, and found it was Colbert, in one hand holding his dagger drenched in blood, and in the other hand a very crude and misshapen bow. "Archer down!" The soldiers all sighed, collectively, in relief, before Oth shouted up the wall towards Colbert. "Why didn't you mention anything?" Colbert jumped off the tax house and rolled through the snow before he stood up and pointed at the area behind the building. "Fucker was tracking us all the way from Emil's," he stated, gesturing a movement pattern. "I wouldn't doubt earlier he moved that old lady's body to where it is, so he'd stop when he'd get his shot." Colbert held out the bow towards Oth, who stood up and walked over to grab and examine it. A face of mixed shock and remorse befell him as he grasped the weapon and ran his fingers along the wood, recoiling and rubbing his middle finger after catching a splinter. "Crude. Homemade. Done very recently," Oth said. "He weren't wearing no Archon or Norta colours fishing." "So, Someone deeply loyal to Ubras, near and dear. Odd paused and sighed deeply. Who's left but Shire Smogleteal? The nastiest lieutenant always seems to die last whenever we do this shit. Engar spoke aloud, rounding the corner back to her group. The fucker deserved it. Martine glared at Engar, who shrugged in response. Martine then closed his eyes and signaled the signum crucis. A sudden, whistling roar billowed along the street, carrying with it a gust of biting cold air, prompting the soldiers to flinch in surprise. Time is short, Oz noted in a commanding tone. Let's move, lads. The flock of 11 shuffled back into formation in record time, and the unit continued along the road up the hill. The moon was now peeking over the horizon in the east, with its faint glow offering little in the way of light. Mid-stride, Colboat pulled another stick from a pouch on his thigh and struck a match to light it. The winds were growing as the storm beckoned. Each second, every step, the barn looked more and more a safe haven than a mere destination, even as the darkness swallowed it whole. It was against all fortune that the winds blew south, flying opposite the soldiers' ascent, bombarding them head-on with the threat of frostbite. Those less acquainted with the cold held their arms against their faces, to shield from it in vain, whereas those native to Scandinavia kept their eyes exposed. Soon enough, both torches blew out, finally defeated by the wind. Thankfully, by this point the moon had risen in the east, and began to cast its faint glow in full, keeping a small portion of the barn in view. It was not much longer before frost infected the wind. Entering the barn was almost night and day. The nip persisted, but the chill from the winds almost ceased entirely. After all 11 men were within its walls, Galib and Engar shuffled to either barn door to push it shut and bar entry for what few gusts could find their way in. Kubart and Colboat retrieved another stick from their thigh pouches and struck fire, then moved to place the fresh torches on the entry sconces after removing the doused sticks previously held. Light blessed the interior of the barn, revealing unpainted oak wood, holding the structure together and a scattering of hay across the floor. "Show yourself, Smargatil!" Oth yelled, less with anger than with exhaustion. "We seek only your arrest. You will not be harmed." A loud cough echoed in the barn before a pale old man revealed himself from a sheet made of a cut knapsack. The man sported a long, straggly beard, turned gray with age, himself balding on the scalp. He pulled himself up to his feet, with the nearby shovel as support, clutching a large bloodied spot on his stomach. "Is that why you brought 8 Khazar sticks with you? To arrest me?" The man grumbled with a gravelly hiss. "The Mudogam lords want you dead. Ogum Woga wants to see you given fair trial." "As if such a beast exists," Swagatil coughed, stabilizing his stance, though still supporting himself on the shovel. "You may as well spare me the humiliation." Engar peeped, but Oth held a finger out to shush him before inhaling sharply himself. "You are an accomplished man. Once upon a time the Republic would have named you a hero. Tell me, what happened?" Oth inquired genuinely. "What made you turn to violence?" "I'll answer that in full after you answer it yourself," Smargatil sneered, then spat to the side. "The men you work for are more violent than I'll ever be. My welcoming party from Tsendok's Union of the Five Towns was not so. The compensation I was promised was replaced with the same old horse shit my people have been fed for centuries." "There are no records that you attempted to pursue recourse via the proper channels," Oth responded, now pacing back and forth, his curiosity growing. "You wouldn't find any. Nobody in Vrednia would draft the papers. Poor old fucking Chumrega helped getting your fucking Tsendok clean up the mess in the colonies, but he's still at Chumrega." "Indeed, though I struggle to understand why that's a problem," Oth solemnly declared. Ubris chuckled in disbelief. "Then maybe you haven't been poisoned by them yet. It's funny. To kill me, they send the one man in Yorwa who at least wants me dead for daring to have Welsh blood." He chuckled again, but it morphed into a violent cough before he stared at Oth with no humor in his eyes. "Strike me down. Do it. Hit me with your fucking fire wands." "This asshole burned on a church veshing," Engar whispered. "Give the word, we'll lice him." "Aye, get it over with. Since you made it here, no doubt my idiot brother made a bloody fight at your hands. Add me to your pile, veshing." Oth looked to the ground, racked with guilt and preemptive remorse. Amidst his pondering, he retrieved a small brown cylindrical roll of paper from his jacket and lit it with a match, then placed the other end in his mouth. "What the fuck are you waiting for? Kill me!" Ubras shouted, now shuffling towards the unit using the shovel as a crutch. "Kill me, and make the world a better fucking place!" Odd removed the object from his mouth and blew outward, producing a massive cloud of thick white smoke. He clenched his other hand into a fist and looked up at Ubras. Fire! One by one, triggers were pulled and bullets were loosed. The sound barrier was shattered eightfold. With no space to escape, the noise echoed and bounced around the barn and through the soldiers' eardrums. Several of the men dropped to the rifles to clutch their ears and yelp in pain. Blood began to trickle down their necks to their shoulders. In spite of the blood, Martin held his stance and waved the signum crucis. Odd fell to his knees. He looked up towards Schmarkatil, vision doubling as his skull rang from the noise. He could make out a large mass of blood and gore where Ubras once stood, with something resembling a body somewhere in the middle. As the noise died and his vision stabilized, the kill was confirmed. Ubras's head was gone among other limbs. The deed was done, and all there was to greet them in congratulations was the snowstorm fighting to breach the interior. Oth pulled out a small box and opened it, revealing a set of cigars. "Come, light one, boys," he struggled to say. "The Navastians say they give warmth." "What?" Elar screeched. Kubart walked up and grabbed a handful of cigars to pass around, lighting them before he handed them off to each soldier. Minutes passed as the soldiers all began to gravitate towards, forming a sitting circle in the center of the barn, victorious though damaged, and only tobacco to soothe them. "Well done, lads," Odd said. "Well done.